Hi there. In this video I'm going to talk about my Fifth Symphony. I'm going to introduce the piece and discuss some of the broader aspects about it as well as the individual movements. So it's kind of curious. It was about a year ago from when I'm recording this that I was really beginning to ramp up the extent to which I was working on this symphony, and it really did ramp up to a point where it's in many ways dominated my life for the month of November 2024. So I'll say a little bit about the genesis of the piece and then talk about the movements. I have some notes here because it's very easy for me to go off on tangents and get totally sidetracked because I love these things so much and they really are such a vital part of me. The first thing I'll say is that I wrote the piece from late October to late December of 2024. And for me, that was an important time because the bulk of it was during my study abroad semester. So I was away from home for the first time in any really extended sense. And by home here, I mean my home country of the United States. And I lived in Copenhagen, Denmark. It actually was in some ways prompted by a lot of the European music that I heard. I was going to a lot of concerts during my time abroad with some dear friends and heard a lot of music that had a great influence on me. And it was not as if I hadn't heard some of this music before, though some of it was new. But of course, hearing it live and hearing it on the continent in which it was written across different cities and countries was a pretty profound experience. So it was specifically after my time in Berlin, where I got to see the Berlin Philharmonic, a dream that I had had since middle school, I think, that I was prompted to really begin to write a symphony in particular. A lot of my effort earlier in the abroad semester had been towards an opera project, which is still ongoing. Needless to say that once this symphony kind of came up in ideation, I took it and really ran with it because the piece really captivated me, and it was just one of those pieces that almost seemed somehow to write itself. And I think a lot of that has to do with the extraordinary influence of being abroad and being in a different place. So that sort of culmination, that very important musical event of seeing the Berlin Phil, was a big impetus for my own creativity and motivation and persistence in writing the piece. But certainly, the city that influenced it more was Copenhagen. I lived in Østerbro, Copenhagen, and Østerbro is a neighborhood. It's not a suburb per se, it's still very much in the city. It's in Copenhagen proper. It's to the north of the main city center. And there are these beautiful artificial lakes that you can just take a long walk through the autumn leaves and whatnot. And from where my apartment was, you had about an hour-ish walk to the city center if you took the scenic route. Now, of course, you could take the metro and be there in, 8 minutes, which is what I did most days going to university. But you always had that option of taking a long walk and being there with yourself in the slightly cold but nice breeze and seeing the beautiful water and people riding their bikes and the changing scenery and whatnot. It's a very beautiful city and a very beautiful district of a beautiful city, and certainly had a lot of influence. And a lot of this piece was written on such walks and spent throughout this place. The influence of Copenhagen and more broadly Europe was profound. I was influenced by a lot of the music that I heard during my time abroad in concert too, and I heard a wide variety of pieces performed, but 3 of them that had a really large influence were works by Shostakovich, who's still, I would argue, still really my favorite composer. Mahler, I got to hear Das Lied von der Erde, and that was a profound experience. That was the first concert that I went to during my time abroad, and so I really still only spoke English in terms of what was relevant in Denmark, and really could not work my way around the concert hall that time. So that was quite a fun and challenging but profound experience. And the third was Hindemith, actually. I got to hear some Hindemith and was very, very taken aback by some of what I was hearing and really fell in love with him. And it's very interesting because then I came home, and the next semester here at Brown, where I'm recording this, we played the Symphony in B-flat that he wrote for band. In fact, he wrote that piece after coming to the United States from his native Germany. And he wrote it for one of the military bands. It might have been the Marines. I'm not entirely sure. I believe it was the Marines, but I'm sure that could be verified. So I apologize for my deficit of knowledge. Those three composers were certainly on my mind, but there was a broader tradition and a really big lineage, in some sense, that I was trying to be a part of. And you see, my background is distinctly American, of course, because I grew up here and I've lived here all my life, save for these couple of months. And musically, that is very true as well. But I tried to fit into this kind of different, and by different, I mean different to me. It was unusual for me. It was unknown. I tried to fit into this different tradition, this grand European tradition of big symphonies. And if I had to add a fourth composer, maybe Bruckner comes to mind, as I heard Bruckner by the orchestra in Copenhagen as well. And of course, Bruckner just wrote these massive, massive symphonies. And of course, one of them would classically be considered as a tragedy to triumph symphony, much like Beethoven's Fifth, or arguably Shostakovich's Eighth Symphony, another piece that was very much on my mind during this semester. And my own piece has echoes of that somehow. There are echoes of this sentiment. It begins, as we will mention in a moment, in C, and it ends in C. But the end is not really triumphant, and so I characterize the piece not as a tragedy to triumph piece, but as one of these grand kind of European tradition symphonies, as it was very much influenced by that. So the first movement is the longest movement. It's very inspired by Shostakovich in some respect, that the first movement is the longest movement, and in some ways is the emotional core of the work. And there are these very profound climactic moments that you build up to. So we kind of start, even though we start with the main melody being played, the main melody of the entire symphony, at forte by the violas and subsequently a few bars later the cellos, we still start kind of down here. And we build, and finally you get to a kind of fake out climax, okay? Not all the way there. A few minutes later we get to the real thing, and it is glorious, at least to me. You'll have to listen to it and see if you come to the same conclusion. But there's a long movement. It's just shy of 20 minutes, and it is very much kind of the emotional core. It sets the tone for the rest of the symphony. It's mostly slow, and it is very much oscillating, as I have made these esoteric hand motions to demonstrate. The second movement is quite fast, and I remember distinctly this was actually a metro movement where I was on one of those walks home from the city, a longer walk, and this clarinet solo just pops into my mind in the way that melodies and harmonies so frequently do. It's so interesting how that happens. And it is very much distinct from the main theme of the piece, which after that introduction really doesn't come back in full form until the very end of the piece in the fifth movement. It has come back in variation, and as I would prefer to call it rather than variation, distortion. But it is not back in that full, unambiguous original form until the fifth movement. So we have this very much contrasting clarinet solo, and it was one of those that just popped into my mind. And I cut the walk short because I was like, man, I've got to get on the subway and get home fast so that I can write this thing down, because I didn't then have my manuscripts and my notes for the piece on me. So I cut that walk short and treated it as an emergency on this November day to get home and write this thing down. And this second movement is very straightforward in form. It takes this idea, and it is very much more like a normal distribution, if you'll let me interject with some math. We start not very climactic. We build towards the middle of the movement, and there's this culmination with the French horns and trumpets doing these really big and grand chords, and then we kind of just fall back into some foreshadowing of the fifth movement. Very simple in form, even though the melodic content is quite complex. The third movement is another longer movement and slower, and it's centered around this English horn solo, and this is another idea that was one of those that just popped into my mind. This one popped into my mind one evening. I spent many of the evenings in Copenhagen, kind of doing artistic sort of things, if you will. I was working really hard on some poetry at that time as well, and I spent many of the evenings in very hygge situations, working on poetry and sharing the time with friends. And it was one of these typical evenings, the date of which is forever lost to time in some kind of sentimental and beautiful sense, that this core of the third movement came. The third movement is very interesting. It's a very personal movement. It is almost dealing with the theme of migration and of change. And we migrate in this from C sharp minor. It is the most tonal movement, I could say. We migrate from C sharp minor to the relative E major, though without neglecting the fact that we also do some kind of crazy adjacent stuff in F major as well. There's plenty of dissonance, don't worry. But it's a lovely little movement, and it is probably the simplest movement in form, though certainly not the one with the most, or least rather, emotional depth. The fourth movement is the shortest. It is fast, it is invigorated, and it is very potent. It is quite demanding of the players, and thus is quite a short movement because it is loud, it is potent, and it is in some ways climactic. Yet there is an irony in this movement, and it is constructed with that irony from the initial starting point. The culmination and the climax of the movement, at only a few minutes in, because again it is quite a short movement, are the first time where the B theme from the first movement, initially presented in that movement by the horns, comes back, but this time it's in the lows. It's very strong and very loud, and it is juxtaposed with only a fragment of the A theme, the main theme of the whole symphony, which is in the highs. It is in the winds and the strings to a lesser extent. So both of the themes are there, but they are fragmented. And although it is a climactic moment, somehow we go straight from this absolute, most intensity moment of the entire symphony where everyone has fortissimo, loud cubed. We go from that straight into the fifth movement with this very quiet and peculiar bassoon solo in 5/4. And yet somehow the tension feels even greater in the fifth movement, even though in terms of the raw power that is attained and the kind of implied tension, it is much, much greater in the fourth movement. So the fifth movement is something difficult to characterize then. It is an enigma in some way. It was very interesting to write this movement, and it came very quickly. I wrote it in only 2 days, in fact, this movement, from start to finish. It was the last movement. I had the other 4 movements completely done at that time. In fact, the first, second, and fourth movement were done entirely in Europe. The bulk of the third movement was done, and I was just finishing, I was kind of translating from some sketches into orchestration and the final movement. And the fifth movement only kind of ideated in my head, but not written down yet, by the time I was coming home from Europe. And so that was the work that was done back home in the States as a kind of postlude, if you will. And postlude is a fitting description of the fifth movement in some ways. It takes the end of the second movement, an ending that may seem a little out of place. It seems to come kind of from nowhere, and it is not unfitting, but it is certainly almost adjacent. It is not directly entwined with what is going on in the second movement. Now that suddenly comes back, and it all kind of contributes to this feeling that the work has come full circle. We hear it takes forever. It is a longer movement, though not as long as the first or third. It is still much longer than the fourth, and longer than the second. And it takes time to, again, come from this fragmented sort of thing where pieces of that second movement, pieces of that culmination are there, but not presented in the whole. And in that sense, that fragmentation coming together into some culmination with high tension, even though the raw intensity is less, in that way, it is very much a direct continuation in style and not just explicitly in semantics of the fourth movement, the preceding movement, the penultimate movement. And you build until we finally, with the tonic in the high winds, get back to that point of the second movement. But it is less triumphant here. And from there, the strings dare to go even higher, and they get to their sustained open fifth, C to G, and we return to the first movement after nearly an hour of symphony, this thing comes to a close quietly, much quieter than it began. So that is a brief description of Symphony No. 5. Again, it was one of the most important pieces that I've ever written. For me, it's a very personal piece and one that I love from the bottom of my heart. And I hope you will enjoy it as much as I thoroughly enjoyed writing it, and as much as I still enjoy every subsequent listen. Thanks very much.